Hi everybody, and welcome to the University of Rhode Island College Algebra Enhancement video series. In this video we're going to be talking about solving equations using factoring. So before we begin, we really have to look at one property, and that's called the zero product property. And what this property says is that if you have two things that are multiplied together, say A and B, if we multiply A and B together and somehow we get 0, then we know that either the first term was 0, or the second term was 0. So for an example, if we look at this equation, if I ask you to solve the equation x minus 4 times x plus 2 equals 0, what I mean by solve is I mean find every x value for which this equation holds. Well, by the zero product property we know that either x minus 4 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. All right, and from the first equation we get that x must be 4. So if x equals 4, we have equality, and if x equals negative 2. And now it's pretty easy to check that if you take both of these values and you plug them back into the equation, you're going to get 0. Alright, so the two solutions to this equation would be x equals 4 and x equals minus 2, all by the zero product property. Alright, so now let's look at how we can use fast. So if you're asked to solve the following equations, in this case we're given a quadratic equation. In a previous video we talked about using the quadratic formula, so you can look back at that technique, but the technique you're going to learn here is a lot easier. So the first step is to collect all the terms on one side, which we already have in this case, and the next step would be to factor. So we had a previous video to discuss factoring, so I'm not going to talk about the details too much here, but this factors to x minus 4 times x plus 2. Now whenever you factor in the context like this, make sure off to the side you check that factoring, and you can check it just by distributing everything back in to make sure that you factored correctly. So before you solve the equation, make sure you factor correctly. Okay. So now we're going to use the zero product property, and the zero product property says that since this x minus 4 times x plus 2 is equal to 0, then either the first is equal to 0 or the second is equal to 0. So this is the same example that we just had. We just had to factor to get to that first stage. So we get the two answers, x equals 4 and x equals negative 2. All right. So this is a quadratic equation with two distinct solutions. We can also get the exact same answers if we use the quadratic formula, but it takes a little longer. Now let's look at a second example here. So again, the first step is we're going to collect all of the terms on one side, so it's easier to collect them on the left in this case. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to factor this. Now, in a previous video we discussed how to factor trinomials where your first leading coefficient is not a 1. So these are kind of the more complicated examples to factor. So if you recall, the technique is to find two numbers that have a sum of negative 7, that's your b coefficient here, and a product of 2 times minus 15, which is negative 30. So we want to find two numbers that have those two properties, and you'll notice that negative 10 and 3 work. When you add minus 10 to 3, you get negative 7, and when you multiply them, you get negative 30. So then what you do is you replace the negative 7x by minus 10x plus 3x. Alright, so I'm not changing the equation, I'm just rewriting 7x in a very convenient way. And then we factor by grouping. So I group the first two terms together and the second two terms together, and I factor out a greatest common factor. So the first two terms, your greatest common factor is 2x, which leaves you with x minus 5. And in the next term you have a greatest common factor of a 3, which leaves you with x minus 5. All right, and you proceed to factor out the greatest common factor from these two terms, which is x minus 5. So we can pull that all the way out front. So we have x minus 5. And then what's left from the first term here is 2x, and what's left from the second is a plus 3. So you end up with 2x plus 3. And this is all equal to 0. And so finally you can now jump into the zero product property, which says that either this is 0 or this is 0. So you get x minus 5 is 0, or 2x plus 3 is 0. And these are small linear equations that we can solve. So we get the first answer of 5, and we get the next answer of -3 over 2. So again, two solutions. If we plug these two, if we inputted these solutions into the equation, we would find that it satisfies this equation, and that's a good thing to check. Always check your answers with this type of work. Let's ramp it up a little bit and do something a little bit more difficult. So here we have not a quadratic equation anymore, but we have a degree 4 polynomial, and I want to solve this equation. So again, what that means is I want to find every x value for which I can plug into this equation and have it equal 0. Okay? So the technique is to factor this completely. So you're going to learn this in your pre-calculus course a little more in depth, but we're going to kind of touch it here. I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor from all of these terms, and I notice they all have an x. So let's do that first. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look on the inside of these parentheses here, and I'm going to factor that by grouping. All right, and by grouping, that means I'm going to group the first two terms and group the second two terms, all within those parentheses. So make sure you leave the parentheses. You're working inside the parentheses. So I pull out an x squared in the first group. So that's what replaced this here. And then in the next group, they both have a common factor of -4, leaving x plus 1. Again, whenever you factor, you can undo the steps by distributing to make sure that you did it properly. All right, then you look at these two terms, and you notice they have a common factor of x plus 1. So there's still that x on the outside. You factor out an x plus 1. And then the thing that's left from the first term is an x squared, and from the second is a -4. Okay. Now we're almost done, but you should notice from a previous video that this is a special product. That's a difference of squares. And we have a formula for that, to factor that even further, and that's x plus 2, x minus 2. Okay, so we have this big long list. This is fully factored, and we can apply the zero product property. Since the entire product equals 0, either this is 0, x plus 1 is 0, x plus 2 is 0, or x minus 2 is 0. And so we set all of those things equal to 0 to see what x value would give you that property. And we found that x is 0, x is -1, x is -2, and x is equal to 2. These are 4 solutions which all satisfy the original equation, and it's a good thing for you guys to check if you would like. It's a good exercise. Example is this simple example: x squared equal to 4. Most people would look at this and say, okay, great, let me take a square root of both sides, and the answer is 2. And you'd miss one of the solutions, because -2 is also a solution to this equation. So this can also be solved via factoring, and that's in the same way. You collect everything to one side, you look at this and you say, okay, I can factor that. That's a special product, x plus 2 times x minus 2, and the zero product property says that either x plus 2 is 0 or x minus 2 is 0. So you get the two answers: x is equal to -2 and x is equal to 2. Okay, this just shows you some of the techniques that can be used with factoring to solve equations. I'll see you guys next time.